Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fall kickoff of Authors at Wharton. I'm Adam Grant. I am absolutely delighted and honored to introduce Peter Thiel today. There are many, many things that I could say about him, and they would keep us here all afternoon, so I want to cover a few highlights. He started his career probably most famously co-founding PayPal, where he was the CEO, leading and building that company and taking it public. He was the first outside investor in Facebook, which we'll get a chance to hear about in a bit. He's invested in many other extraordinarily successful startups, from SpaceX to LinkedIn. He co-founded Palantir, the killer app company that uses human-machine collaboration to hunt terrorists. He co-produced the movie Thank You for Smoking. He's also been heavily involved in the Founders Fund, breakthrough philanthropy conferences, seasteading for autonomous ocean communities, the Thiel Fellowship, giving $100,000 to 20 under 20 every year to quit college and start a venture instead. I think probably many of us know him best for Silicon Valley, the HBO sitcom, which we'll also speak about. And personally, I would say Peter Thiel is one of the world's greatest tech innovators, investors, and intellectual provocateurs. If you ask him about his intellectual investing philosophy, he'll tell you that he's long on substance and short on status. I want to let you know that after he speaks, we'll be taking questions via Twitter. If you want to use the hashtag WhartonAuthors, I'll be drawing questions from there. And then we'll have a limited book signing afterward for a subset of people who are able to stay behind, but we do have a hard stop a few minutes afterward. So without further ado, tremendous pleasure and honor to welcome Peter Thiel to Wharton Authors. Peter, it's all yours.
Adam, thank you very much for that great intro. In writing the book 0 to 1 and teaching about entrepreneurship, it's always a quite challenging subject to talk about. And I think there's sort of two standard modes people do. One is where you go into great detail on your own experiences, and I sort of tell all sorts of war stories about building PayPal and how we linked email and payments. And that worked in one particular time and place in 1999, but it's not actually all that helpful if you do it today in 2014. And then I think the other type of business book that gets written is what I sort of describe as the pseudo-scientific book, where you have a formula and you follow these 5 steps and you'll build a great company. And I think that I'm also quite skeptical of that approach, because I think that every moment in business, every moment in the history of technology happens only once. That, the next Bill Gates will not build an operating system. The next Larry Page won't build a search engine. The next Mark Zuckerberg won't build a social network. If you're trying to copy these people, you're not in some sense learning from them. And so the question is always, how do we get these great 0 to 1 moments? Science starts with the number 2 with repeatable experiments, but there are no repeatable experiments in business. And so the starting point for 0 to 1 is really thinking about this problem of uniqueness, of how one conceives of these great breakthrough tech companies. And I try to get at this question through various sort of contrarian, thought-provoking questions I pose. The business question I always like to ask is, what great company is nobody building? The more intellectual version of it that I like to ask is, tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on. And if we just take that question, it turns out to be a really tough question as an interview question. And I think there are 2 different reasons it's a tough question. The first one is that we've been taught over and over again that everything that's true is conventional. It's understood by lots and lots of people. And so we're not used to coming up with new truths that people have not thought of before. And this sounds like something that's really hard to do. But it's also a really uncomfortable question to answer, because the correct answer is one the interviewer presumably will disagree with. If the interviewer says, oh, yeah, I already thought of that, or yeah, I agree with that totally, your answer probably was not a really good answer to it. And so there's always something, I think, very uncomfortable about these truly original approaches. And I like to suggest that we live in a world in which courage is in far shorter supply than genius. And this is one of the reasons why this is such a hard question to tackle. In the 0 to 1 book, I give a whole series of answers to this question. I go through a number of things that I believe to be true that most people do not agree with me on. And I'm going to share 3 or 4 of those with you tonight. Let me start with the first one, which is probably the biggest thematic idea that runs through my book, my investing philosophy, advice I give all entrepreneurs. Most people believe that capitalism and competition are synonyms. I believe they're antonyms. I believe that a capitalist is someone who accumulates capital. In a world of perfect competition, all the profits get competed away. And so if you have if you want to compete like crazy for scraps, you should open a restaurant. And the restaurant industry is super competitive, and it's extremely uncapitalistic. Nobody ever makes any money in the restaurant industry. And sort of at the other end of the spectrum, you have sort of these singular sorts of companies, and I use Google as sort of the go-to example, where it's very capitalistic. You have enormous profit margins every year, and there's been no real competition in search since 2002, when Google definitively distanced itself from Microsoft and from Yahoo. And so one of the things I encourage people to really rethink is this question of competition. Competition, I think, is problematic. The chapter I have in the book is All Happy Companies. There's this line from Anna Karenina, the opening line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, where it says, all happy families are alike. All unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I think the opposite is true of business. I think all happy companies are different because they're doing something unique and different that makes them special. All unhappy companies are alike because they fail to escape the essential sameness that is competition. And so you don't want to be the 4th online pet food company or the 10th thin film solar panel company or something like that. You want to be doing something very unique. And so I want to sort of always encourage people to really rethink this question of monopoly or competition. And I think that when you're starting a founder, entrepreneur, someone who's starting a business, the goal you should always have is to create a business that will be a monopoly, because those are the truly valuable companies in our world. Now, I think this question of competition and monopoly is, it's partially, it's not just sort of intellectual failure, there's some bias towards that we don't understand this. I think it's also that we're very heavily socialized to compete all the time, and we're taught that the things that are valuable are things we compete for. And I think it's just the way people sort of get taught from K through 16 or whatever, that the more ferocious the competition, the more valuable it must be. And what competition does is it does make you better at some narrow set of things. So if you're like on a high school athletic team, you get better at swimming because you're competing against the people right around you. But it always comes at this price of losing sight of what may be more important or more valuable. There was a Henry Kissinger line where the battles in academia are so ferocious because the stakes are so small. And this was not just talking about the insanity of his fellow professors at Harvard, where you used to say, well, why would the battles be really ferocious if the stakes are so small? It seems like a formula. You have a ferocious battle if the stakes are big, not if they're small. And so on one level, it sounds like a formula for insanity, but on another level, it just describes the inner logic of the situation. If the stakes are small, if it's really hard to differentiate yourself from the people around you, then the competition becomes more and more and more intense. And so you end up with all these dynamics where people have to fight super hard for these stakes that are really small. And I think it's really important to try to think up front, early on how to avoid this as much as possible when one sets out in a career, in a business, in something that you're doing in life. Differentiate, and there's no safety in crowds. When you have large crowds of people, you end up competing with them in all these ways. I've been somewhat of a critic of some of the things going on in our educational system, and people often say, well, you went to Stanford Law School, and I do think that I would probably still go back and do it again if I had to do it over, but I would ask much harder questions because everything was super tracked. I mean, my 8th grade yearbook in junior high school, one of my friends said, well, I'm certain you'll enter Stanford as a sophomore in 4 or 5 years. And sure enough, that happened. And then went to law school, went to top law firm in New York, and you ended up with this really bizarre dynamic where from the outside everybody was trying to get in, on the inside everybody was trying to get out. After I left the law firm, after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall told me, it's really reassuring to see that it's possible to escape from Alcatraz, which was actually, no, you just had to go out the front door and not come back. But it was psychologically incredibly hard for people to do because the identity was so wrapped up in what they had done, and I think this is the sort of thing I invite all of us to rethink a little bit as we progress. I sort of had this rolling quarter-life crisis in my 20s, and I think that if I had to give my younger self advice, it would be think much harder. Why are you doing this? Where do you want to go with this? And don't always take education or credentialing as a substitute for thinking really hard about your future. Now, let me coming back to this monopoly question. When you start, if you sort of think about the history of entrepreneurship and innovation over the last 250 years, people have really succeeded when two things have been true. When you start a business where you create something of value to the world and you capture some fraction of the value you create. So you create X dollars in value and you get Y% of X. So pretty straightforward math formula. But I think one of the things that people always get wrong is that X and Y are these totally independent variables. And so X can be very big and Y can be 0% a lot of the time. And I think it is, and I think one of the things that's both unusual about software and why sort of Silicon Valley is so incredibly dynamic right now and so successful is because in a lot of these software businesses, people are actually able to capture some decent fraction of the value of what they create. There are many other innovations where this was not the case. The airline industry in the U.S. over 100 years has basically made almost no money. It's been, it's good for society that we have airplanes, but you have about 180 billion a year in domestic ticket sales on airlines, 50 billion a year in search advertising on Google. So you'd say, if you measure it that way, you'd say the airline industry is still more important than search on Google. We'd rather do without Google than without airplanes, probably, if you had to sort of pick between one or the other. But Google as a company is worth 6 times as much as all the airplane companies combined. And I think this, again, reflects this monopoly versus competition dynamic. And I think it is sort of this strange reality that an awful lot of scientists and inventors always have this fantasy that, of course, they're going to get rewarded massively for their inventions, but the somewhat disturbing history is that this has often not been the case. In the first industrial revolution in Britain, where you had the textile factories in the 18th and 19th century got started, it was a lot of innovation, a lot of improvements, but even in 1850, 1860, 100 years into the Industrial Revolution, the great fortunes in Britain were still all the landed aristocracy. The people who started the textile factories, the owners of them, made very little money because all the profits were competed away. They had failed to be differentiated enough. And so I think this is always something to think through really hard. And there is something about software that is so powerful today because it is really this exceptional industry in which the people who create things of value are able to capture some fraction of what they create. Now, a second somewhat contrarian answer to my question. People will always, when you hear this question, tell me something that's true that very few people agree with you on. People will sort of intuitively say, well, there aren't, we've already figured everything out. There are no answers to this, that everything's already understood. And I want to suggest that there are actually many answers left to this question. And I sort of suggest this three-part division into conventional truths, which everybody understands. So it's like 1 + 1 = 2. The Earth goes around the sun. These things are true. They're not terribly valuable. They don't give you any edge because they're already understood by everybody else in the world. There are mysteries, which are things that are impossible to figure out. But then I think in between conventions and mysteries, there are what I call secrets, things that are hard but possible to figure out. And if you work at them, you can figure them out. And it is my thesis that there are many secrets left to be discovered, that if we work at them, we can do them in many, many different areas. Now, there are certainly areas where everything has been discovered. So if you were like in the 18th century and you looked at a map, you could say, well, I don't really know what's at this part of the map, and you could become an explorer and you could find out. And that's not the case anymore today, since we've mapped the whole surface of the planet. There are no secrets left in geography. Or if you were in the 19th century and said, well, I want to become a chemist and discover some new elements, that probably would not be a good idea in the 21st century. So periodic table of elements, the map of the world, these are sort of complete. There are no secrets left there. But most subjects are not like geography or chemistry. Most subjects are still much more on the frontier, and they're ones where we can come up with many types of answers. And I think that I do think that one of the things that often is very is sort of this intuition that's very true in many of these companies, is that people think that there is something they can figure out. If you think you can figure it out, you'll work really hard at it. So at PayPal, I thought there was some really interesting stuff we could figure out around digital currency and changing the nature of money. We actually didn't quite succeed in doing it. We didn't succeed in replacing the US dollar with a new world currency, which was our crazy goal in 2000. But that sort of deep substantive thinking about cryptocurrency helped inspire us to come up with an architecture for the system that turned out to make for a really good payment system in all these other ways. And so I think there are sort of a lot of these secrets left. One of the reasons that people are skeptical of secrets or of their ability to find them is they sort of look around, they think, the world is flat, there's 7 billion other people on this planet, and so it's always either someone else will have figured it out already, or it's impossibly hard, and so I'm not going to be the one to figure this out. And obviously the sort of the paradox is that when everybody believes that to be true, then nobody is looking, and then if you become the one person who looks, you have a much better chance than you might think. And I think we are in this sort of strange world where people are very much believe in globalization. They very much believe in the flatness of the world, and so strangely, people are not trying very hard and looking for all these secrets, all these great new businesses that could be started. Last contrarian answer on this, and I sort of always drew this out in the class and in the book, is trying to contrast different modes of progress in the 21st century. And I think I draw this very strong contrast between globalization and technology. I describe globalization as copying things that work. It's horizontal growth. It's going from 1 to n, and you can sort of think of it as going along an x-axis. And I describe technology as vertical progress, going from 0 to 1, doing new things, intensive rather than extensive growth. And sort of you draw it on a y-axis. And just by putting globalization on an x-axis and technology on a y-axis, you sort of underscore the idea how these two things are really fundamentally different. And I think we always use them synonymously, but I think they are really different. And we should think of these as very different ways for progress to happen. And if we sort of think about the history of the last few centuries, there have been periods of technology and periods of globalization and periods of one or the other. And so, for example, 1815 to 1914, the 19th century was basically a period when you had tremendous globalization and tremendous technological innovation. They were sort of both going at full throttle. 1914, World War I starts. Globalization goes massively in reverse. There's, much less trade. Part of the world becomes communist. It effectively secedes from the rest of humanity. But technology still keeps progressing on many, many different fronts. And then 1971, Kissinger goes to China, and I would argue since 1971, globalization has come back in a very powerful way. And we've had technological progress in the world of computers, somewhat less outside the software area. And so we've been in an era of massive globalization and what I believe to be actually somewhat more modest progress in the area of technology, where there's been progress in bits, but not so much progress in atoms. And this is reflected in some ways in the way we talk about the world. In the 50s or 60s, you would have talked about the world as being divided between the first world and the third world. The first world was the technologically accelerating part of the world. The third world was this part of the world that was just permanently screwed up and stuck. It was just a really bad place. Today, we would talk about the developed and developing worlds. And we would say that the developing world is that part of the world that is copying the developed world, and the sort of dichotomy of developed and developing is this convergence theory of globalization. The entire world is going to globalize. It's going to become more the same as China and all these other countries copy and catch up. And I think what China is doing makes perfect sense. It's very straightforward. You have to just look at what's worked and copy it. You have to avoid copying the things that didn't work. And it's a fairly straightforward 20-year sort of plan that China has. But this developing dichotomy, while it's a pro-globalization dichotomy, is also implicitly an anti-technology dichotomy, because it's telling us that the developed world, the US, Western Europe, Japan, is the part of the world that's developed, that's done, that's finished, where nothing new is going to be done, that we're living in an essentially static or stagnant society, where the younger generation's expectations should be less than their parents. And I think this is something we should be resisting really strenuously as a society. And so I'll end with my contrarian counter question, which is that I think we should all once again ask, how do we go about developing the developed world? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So I guess the place to start is with your famous interview question. For years, you've been asking people, what is the most important truth that most people disagree with you on? And I'd like to pose it in two ways. One is, what's the best answer to that you've ever heard from a job candidate? And then two, if folks in the audience want to give their answers to that question on Twitter, we may read a few of them and get Peter to weigh in on how much he likes your answers.
I'm actually uncomfortable even asking the question that often anymore, because people are so bad at answering it. And even though people can read on the internet that I ask the question all the time, they sort of can prep for it, but they're still really bad at it. I think there's sort of one category of pretty good, like at least A-minus type answers, are ones where you at least acknowledge that it's not original or something like that. So one answer was that was a pretty good answer, was that in venture capital investing, people always think of themselves as being contrarian, as being buying things when they're cheap and when the value is low. And he thought that often the cheapest companies were the ones that looked the most expensive. And so you wanted to be a contrarian bullish, where everyone was really crazy about something, and he wanted to be even crazier in outbidding all the other people, and that this had actually often worked. So that was sort of like a meta-level cut on this, which from my experience actually was surprisingly accurate.
Mm-hmm. Good. So let's take that then to the world of Facebook. So we have a number of people wanting to know how you know who's going to be a good monopoly and how you choose your bets.
Well, if you're a startup, so the key thing to have a monopoly is to have a large share of a market. And I would say that one of the big conventional beliefs that I very much disagree with is that you always want to go after really big markets, because and the problem is, when you start a company, you're starting small, and so to dominate a market quickly, you should go after a small market and capture that whole market first. So I would say that Facebook, for example, had a very auspicious start. It started with 10,000 people at Harvard, a market that's so small that any sort of business school analysis would say it's not even a business. It's too small a market. But you got from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. So that was a good start. PayPal started by going after eBay power sellers, which was, again, a
relatively discrete, small market in 99, 2000. There were like maybe 20,000 people. We got to about 30% market share in 2-3 months. The opposite extreme of this was, I think, all the sort of clean tech companies in 2005 to 2008. When you saw their pitch decks in Silicon Valley, the opening slide always said, you know, we're in the energy market, and this is a market that's measured in hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. And so when you have a market that's that big, that's almost immediately a red flag that it's a bad company. Because if you're a minnow in a vast ocean, you just have competition everywhere. You know, you're one of only 10 thin film solar panel companies, and if you beat the other 9, then you have to compete against the other 90 solar panel companies that are using different technologies, and then you have to compete against wind and natural gas, and then you have to compete against the Chinese manufacturers, and on and on. So if you're in a $1 trillion market, you might as well just open a restaurant. That's also a $1 trillion business.
So what else did you see in Mark and in Facebook early on that led you to invest?
Well, it was definitely, you know, it was fundamentally a good company. They only needed money to buy more computers because they had already scaled to 20 colleges. There was so much demand, and they just needed the capital to buy more computers. So that's generally always a good sign when that's one of the most important things a company needs, just to sort of can barely keep up with demand. I think there's often a investor bias where investors like to invest in things that they themselves tend to use. And so I think Facebook was very undervalued for the first 2 years when it was a college-only site, because most college students are not actually investors. And so there was something about the intensity of the usage that was very badly missed. So I think Facebook was undervalued 04, 05, 06, and then they sort of opened the site up in late 06. And then you had a huge up round in 07 led by Microsoft, and then I think it sort of got more fully valued.
Mm-hmm. So if we think about the next Facebook, Shlomo Clapper wants to know what areas are ripe for a new monopolistic order, and if you fast forward a couple decades, what valuable company is no one building that they should be?
Well, obviously, this is a question for you guys to answer, for all of you to answer here. I think you can never answer these questions thematically. So what I'm always very skeptical of is when people say, there's this trend, we're very excited about things in this space or this area, because when you have a space or a sector, that somehow is poorly defined, because that means you have lots of people doing it. And so I think I'm sort of allergic to almost all the buzzwords. I think big data, cloud computing, these are all sort of borderline fraudulent buzzwords. They're sort of used in all these horrible ways. I'm not sure what they really mean. SaaS software, too much. Healthcare IT, mobile internet, education software. So these are the kinds of things that are really bad answers. And the good answers are ones that are often so unique that they can't easily be described. We're investors in Airbnb, which I think is, perhaps the next $100 billion plus consumer internet company. If I had to pick one coming out of Silicon Valley today, and it's again, but then if you say, well, what exactly is it? They've tried to define themselves as being part of the sharing economy, which is just sort of like, it's not clear that's quite the right category, but it's just this sort of one of a kind, very different company. It somehow created this new inventory around people's houses in the tourism industry, but it doesn't really fit into any conventional categories at all. Those are the ones that I think we're missing.
So when you rattled off those buzzwords, you just killed about 19 companies in the audience.
Well, it's better now than later.
So I have to.
You shouldn't go into Renaissance painting either. All sorts of careers you shouldn't go into.
So there are two directions.
You shouldn't become a pirate. You shouldn't try to discover new places on the map. So hopefully not too many people have stopped from doing that.
So in the book, you're critical about another one of those popular conventional tracks, which is consulting. Tell us why you hate consultants.
Now, hate is always a little bit too strong a word, but I think that it's probably peaked as a career path in the U.S. I think McKinsey was probably at its peak in the mid-'80s. In the U.S., the global peak at McKinsey was, I would say, around 2000. There was sort of a huge global prestige, and it took about 15 years for people in the rest of the world to figure out they weren't really doing that much anymore. And I think there were sort of all these really badly managed companies in the 60s and 70s, and so there was something consultants could do to improve that. At this point, I think it sort of is much less the case. The part that I'm skeptical of it as a, it's sort of, I sort of think a lot of people end up going into things where, it always depends why you are becoming a consultant. Let me give a more granular answer. It would be good to become a consultant if that's actually what you wanted to do. If you really enjoy consulting and working on these different projects. But if it's more like, well, it'll expose me to these different companies, and then I can work at one of these companies 3-4 years down the line, where it's sort of this option diagram where it's actually, you go to business school because you don't know what to do, then after business school you become a consultant because you don't know what to do, and then it just generates this sort of branching tree diagram structure of options. And I find that, and the problem with, I think we do too much of that as a society, where we get line items on our resume that give us this branching tree diagram structure. And what you have to tell me is, well, okay, so you go to McKinsey, 3 years from now, there will be 10 different really cool options for you. Can you tell me what they are? And, oh no, you can't possibly do that. And I think the reality is that the options end up being things like working in mid-level management at a Fortune 500 company. And if that's really what you want to do, then you should do it right now.
So you just took the whole business model of consulting apart, which is good.
Well, not totally, but
I think it's a good message for our audience to hear.
you have some biases of your own, I gather.
Maybe. So the other direction I want to take this is a few people have tweeted in to ask if you ever give career advice. And I know you'll be holding office hours tomorrow all day for that. But when you think about undergrads, MBA students, and when you yourself were at that stage, what would you tell sort of a 20 or 25-year-old Peter Thiel?
Well, I alluded to a little bit of it in my talk that I think you always want to focus on substance over status. It's always really hard to give advice because you have to actually spend a lot of time with somebody. I don't think you can do this in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. The sort of question that I always like to ask as a starting question is, how much money do you have to make? And basically, the higher the number, the narrower the set of choices you have, and I think that's sort of a fairly straightforward trade-off that you have. And so I think that there are a very large number of options people have. If you're not that fixated on it, if you need to have a very large salary, you have to become a consultant. No choice.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about anti-aging technology. A few people have asked about your investments in that, and in particular, Joshua Lee wants to know if you think you're going to die.
I don't think it's terribly constructive to think about that too much. People always say that you should live every day as though it's going to be your last, and I always think you should live every day as though it's going to go on forever. And that's sort of the mindset I like to have, because I think that you want to be starting great new projects. You want to be treating the people around you like you're going to be working with them for a long time. And so I always like to have the mindset that you live every day as though it's going to go on forever.
So let's talk about then reinventing the way that we live. Claire Lee has asked about seasteading and is curious about what we should be thinking about when building autonomous communities at sea and why you've gone that route.
Well, this is like one of these tiny side projects that has gotten blown way out of proportion over the years. And I think one of the things I did underestimate with the seasteading project was how much interest it would generate. And so because there is this sense that the map is full, that there is no physical frontier left. Outer space is probably a little bit too far away. And so there is sort of this idea that it would be really cool to experiment with different kinds of governments, different kinds of ways of organizing society. And that's something we can't quite do, and it would be cool if we could do it. I don't think the seasteading test is going to happen anytime soon, but it always generates enormous amounts of interest because people do have the sense that it would be cool to try doing some different things.
And if it did happen, would you be in line to join John Galt and Ayn Rand there, or would you want to just observe from a distance?
I might observe from a distance to start.
See how the experiment goes. So there are a lot of people watching Silicon Valley on HBO, and there are rumors at least going around that one of the characters may or may not have been based on you. Have you seen the show? What's your reaction to it?
Yeah, I've seen this show. It's always very flattering. I would never drive as small a car as the actor has in the show, and it's always very dangerous. If you start copying it too much, that would be dangerous. So I think the people at our foundation would be very upset if we organized a toga party like they had on the show.
All right, so Parash Shah wants to know, when were you wrong and why? And there are some specific questions about bad investments that you might have learned from, but I think this can go broader if you choose.
Well, there are certainly many mistakes that have been made over the years. If I had the single biggest mistake I would say that I made in the last decade was not doing the Series B round at Facebook. So I was in on the Series A, and it really goes. This was a very interesting illustration of how the dynamics in these companies evolve. So the Series A round was done summer of 2004. Post money was $5.7 million. Series B was April 2005. Pre-money was $85 million. Post was 98. So it was about 12 to 15x the value of the round from 12x on a per share basis, about 17x overall from what the company was worth only 8-9 months earlier, and so on the inside, all of us thought this is an insanely high valuation. Zuckerberg asked me, "Well, would you like to do it?" And I already own a lot. This valuation seems insanely high, but I think we all were miscalibrating how high the value was. It was still. Facebook still had only 8 or 9 people in spring of 2005 working at the company. You went into the same office every day. It was covered with the same horrible graffiti art someone had put on the office. And so psychologically, every day that you came into work, you didn't think that things had really changed. There were these abstract graphs that were trending in a happy northeasterly direction, but people didn't really understand that. And so I think there are these subtle dynamics where there are points when the leverage really changes. There are points when the value really changes, and people tend to underestimate it a great deal. There's also a negative version of this. So you have a company where nothing's changed in a year, and it's possible the value's gone way down because it's like you run out of time, or it's like this decaying option where you're going to build something and you couldn't quite get it to work. And so from the inside, we often underestimate how much these things are changing. And I think this was why I think the contrarian bullish answer was actually a pretty good answer to my question, because in technology, it's often when things are really working, we're still not bullish enough. I course corrected for this on the Series C round in Facebook in 2006, where I did then invest again. And so I think that very often when you have tremendous momentum, it's underestimated. There's always all this sort of resentment, jealousy that comes into play in these things, where people will say, Zuckerberg's already made too much money. This whole thing's going to blow up. It can't go much further. And there sort of are ways in which that kind of thinking, I think, ends up being quite pervasive, and it's one of the reasons people's intuitions about how well these things can work are often somewhat limited.
Has that changed your investing at all, looking back on that experience?
Yeah, no, I changed it the next year. So so I think I did the back testing on this. Every single time there was a steep up round led by a smart investor, it always worked out. It was always cheap. And the steeper the up round, the cheaper the deal.
So I'm going to try to tie a few questions together here. There are a few people who want to know what your life is like what's the last thing you do before bed and the first thing before you wake up. There are also some people who want to know who's the most interesting entrepreneur that you hang out with, and possibly related, do you get to hang out with Elon Musk?
Well, let's see. There's probably not. I always worry that I'm actually very bad at setting any good example on these things. I think I'm sort of somewhat disorganized. Things are not, incredibly super structured in different ways. I managed to focus on getting, a few important things done, and then there's probably all these other ways I'm, fairly disorganized. I end up having lots of meetings with different people in the course of the day, so it's always these interesting conversations with many different people. Elon is probably one of the most impressive entrepreneurs in the U.S. today. There's something very charismatic about Tesla and SpaceX, because we have this sense of society that's been a little bit too heavily overweighted software, not enough on everything else. And so there's something very powerful about getting these companies to work in a non-software context. But yeah, he's quite busy. If you're CEO of 2 companies, and if you have 5 kids, and so on, it adds up.
So I guess as a sort of a follow-on from that, there are a lot of people who are sort of interested in your observation that software is actually where we've made a lot of progress, but that it's caused stagnation in other areas, and that you're hoping to see more serious radical innovation or vertical innovation and growth in other domains. What do you think it's going to take to get some of that to start happening?
It's we keep on the venture fund side, we keep probably about 2/3 of our work is still in the core software space. So I think that is still the default of what's going to continue to work. I think in a lot of the other areas, I end up being very focused on the business model. You often have these brilliant scientists, and they are incredibly bad at picking business partners. The people and so the intuitions around, and so the kinds of things that have worked really well are ones where you have somehow the engineering or science part is really well integrated into the business intuitions really make sense. And so I don't know. It's sort of, I don't want to pick on professors too much, but it's sort of like if you have a professor running a company, that's often a bad sign because they'll have all these theories about how things are supposed to work. And their ideas are so valuable. The ideas will carry the day, and then the actual translation of well, if you build it, will people come? How do you distribute it? How do you market it? Those questions are given way too short a shrift.
So I can't resist. What would you say if I told you there was a paper published in 2007 by Jiang and Murphy who showed that companies run by B school professors outperform the market? Hypothetically.
Well, I believe I don't question the paper exists. I don't, and then it's always a little bit. There's so many different variables in these things. There's always a question: what counts as the market? So
so let's say hypothetically again, a matched set of control companies in the same industry.
Don't know if you can control them well enough, given my view that these things are never quite controllable, never quite repeatable. But I think that I think most companies don't do very well, and this is sort of the crazy thing. Most companies don't end up being monopolies. One of the chapters in my book, I go through this sort of power law-like distribution, where one of the very odd patterns in a venture fund is that you might think it's like you have a portfolio of different companies you're invested in, but it turns out that the single best investment is often worth as much as everything else put together. And the second best one maybe is worth as much as 3 through n, and on and on. And so you have this unbelievably uneven distribution of results where there are a few spectacularly successful companies, a lot of others much less clear. So if you were the 100th person at Google, you did way better than if you were the CEO, founder of most venture-backed startups in Silicon Valley. And this is, again, is very counterintuitive because we always like to think of it as like these, we're in this position and CEO is better than being, the VP of business development. That's better than being, the assistant customer service person. But because the outcomes vary so much more by company than within company, it actually may be far more important to get into the right company than even what specifically you're doing in it.
So there are a lot of questions about first mover advantage on that, and how, on the one hand, if you're supposed to build a monopoly, you should be sort of first, right, in a domain where nobody else is active. On the other hand, we think of Facebook and Google and others who weren't the first to social networks or to search. How do you think about whether you should be first or later?
Well, you want to be, so the buzzword I give is you want to have the last mover advantage. You want to be the last. So if you want the chess analogy, if you move first, it's your white, it's equivalent to a 1/3 of a pawn advantage to go first. Last is, you sort of win the game. And it's like the Capablanca World Chess Champion line to begin, you must begin by studying the end game. And so it's always worth asking, how do these things play out over time? At PayPal in March of 2001, we'd been in business for 27 months. We did this complicated discounted cash flow analysis on the business, and it's somewhat of a fictional exercise, but it did directionally show something that I think was very true, which was that 3/4 of the value of the company came from cash flows in years 2011 and beyond, and so most of the value in these companies is really far in the future, and therefore. People are always way too focused on the near term because that's the growth, that's the stuff you can measure. The durability is somehow harder to measure, but qualitatively far more important. And so I do think these questions about why will you be the last mover, why will you have a sustainable advantage, are the key questions to ask. Certainly, in many of the software businesses, the people who do something really well first also end up being last because they grow quickly enough that nobody can copy them. I would say that and this is again where the categories become a little tricky. I would say you could say Google and Facebook were not the first search engines or first social networking companies respectively, but maybe Google was the first with a PageRank algorithm that really automated search, and that was maybe a breakthrough that was very fundamental to search. And Facebook was the first social network that really got real identity to work. One of my good friends, Reid Hoffman, who started LinkedIn in 2003, in the 90s had started a company. In 1997, he started a company called SocialNet. So he already had social networking in the name of the company in 1997, 7 years before Facebook comes along. And their theory was that it was all about these social relations on the internet, and they were all going to be these complicated different things, and maybe you were a cat and I was a dog, and we'd have these avatars, and how would we all get along? And that turned out not to be what people wanted, real identity, not fake identity.
One of the questions that's come up here, we have a lot of people in the audience who are interested in building companies, and there's a choice at some point you have to make about, do I want to be an entrepreneur, do I want to be a venture capitalist, do I want to do both? And Matt Kalmans wants to know, what's the biggest difference you see between a successful venture capitalist and a successful entrepreneur?
Well, I think I'm not sure there's a big difference per se. I think the thing that's very different about the two kinds of things, a great entrepreneur, you have to sort of have one fantastic idea and then execute against it over a really long period of time, and it often is enough to have just that one massive breakthrough. As a venture capitalist, you have to, in some sense, constantly find new answers to this question. You have to constantly find new companies to invest in, and so you never quite get to this point where it's automatic. But it's somewhat more intellectual, so you're always thinking a little bit more, which is what I like. It's less operational. You have less control, and there is an aspect where that's really critical. I think the combination is is something one should always try to resist. So, venture capitalists trying to act as pseudo-founders or partially managing their companies, that never works. It's when we write the check and give it to people, we have to assume that we're not going to be able to influence them in any way whatsoever. Do we fully trust them with the money? And if we think to ourselves, no, we don't really trust them, but we'll be able to manage it after we give them the money, that's always a bad sign.
That's a great segue to Emily's question. What do you look for in an entrepreneur when you're investing?
We certainly we look for people. I would say it's great business strategy, great technology, great people, and it's typically a great team. I often like asking, and one of the ways in which business I think is very different from schooling. In a college context, it's always you against everybody. It's pure competition. In a business context, you typically can't start one of these businesses all by yourself. It's like a team of people, and the dynamics of how well those people work together are incredibly important. And so I often like asking these prehistory questions. Tell me, how did you meet? How long have you been working on this? When did you first come up with this idea? So a bad answer is something like, we met a week ago at a networking function, and we both wanted to start companies, and we decided to become entrepreneurs and do this. And that's sort of like, we met at the slot machines in Las Vegas and we got married. You might hit the jackpot. It's probably a bad idea. And then I think the good answer is something like, we've been friends for 4 or 5 years. We've been talking about doing this. We've been thinking about all these different things. I'm the business person. The other person's the technical person. There's sort of this complementarity. That's the kind of answer that's really good.
What about on the other side? So if you're looking to join an early stage startup or a high growth company, what should you be looking for?
Well, this is always sort of the subjective part, but I'd say, do you like the people? Do you think you can become good friends with these people? And I think that's such a critical part to getting these things to work. You want these, this is always sort of my rolling quarter life crisis. One of the law firms I interviewed with in New York, one of the partners told me it was a place where everybody hated everybody else, but they all made lots of money. And it was sort of an illustration of how incredibly professional they were. They didn't really like any of their other partners, but it all worked. And I think that we need things that are more than just professional, that more than just work. And so I think that's always something to think about really hard.
So Alex Verdone wants to know, if you were in the Wharton MBA program right now, what would you do upon graduation? And you can't work for you.
I can never give like super precise answers to everybody on this. Let's see. You should be careful. I haven't looked at the studies on this at Wharton. There were these studies done at Harvard Business School over the years where they found that you had these very extroverted people who weren't quite sure what they wanted to do after graduation. They all sort of come together for 2 years at business school. And you have this sort of bad wisdom of crowds dynamic where they look at what everyone else is doing, they listen to what everyone else is doing, and they found that whatever the largest number of people did was always a bad idea. So it was like the surfing analogy is like, if you're trying to catch a wave, you have to start paddling before the wave's there. Like once the wave's already there, you'll never catch the wave. It's past, and you should never try to catch the last wave. And so in 1989, all these people were trying to work for Mike Milken. It was a year or two before he went to jail and the whole junk bond thing blew up. In 99, 2000, people wanted to work in Silicon Valley for startups. They'd never wanted to do that before. This was just before everything went wrong. 05, 07, it was all real estate, all sort of private equity. And so I think it's, I would say if everybody's doing, try not to do the thing that the largest number of people are doing.
So that brings us to education. There are people who are interested in your take on what you would teach if you were leading a business school class, and also how you would fix K through 12 education.
You know, I'm not sure I can fix every single problem in the world. I would say one of the things I think that's very tricky about education is that it's always used as this super abstract word. And this is a problem with like a lot of the education startups. It's like we're involved in education, but what is education actually? And I think that I argue that we have an education bubble where people are spending too much money on it in all these different ways. But one of the things that's characterized all these bubbles in recent years, whether it was the dot-com bubble or the housing bubble or the education bubble, is that they involve way too much abstraction, and people don't clearly talk about what is really going on. And so sort of a non-bubble way of talking about education would decompose education. We'd ask, is education, is it an investment decision where you're putting in a certain amount of money, you're learning a skill, and then you'll get a really good job out of it? Is education a consumption decision where it's a 4-year party? And maybe it's good as a consumption decision, maybe it's good as an investment decision. It's probably, you can start getting the decision wrong if you sort of blend these together in the wrong way. So if you say, well, it's not really a great 4-year party. If I wanted a 4-year party, I'd do something totally different. It's not really a good investment decision, but it's sort of a combination of both. Then you sort of have a bad investment plus bad consumption decision. Doesn't quite add up. So you want to really think through, which is it, investment decision? Is it a consumption decision? Is it an insurance product where you're buying it to avoid falling through the big cracks in our society? Or is it a tournament where you know, it's really important that you get into the best schools, because if you have a diploma from a bad school, it's really a dunce hat in disguise, or something like that. And so I think the basic challenge with education in the U.S. is that most people, not the people in this room, because I think people in this room sort of won the tournament by getting in here, but most people think of education as an insurance product, but they're really being sold a tournament. And if you think about insurance and tournaments are incredibly different kinds of financial products to be involved in. And I think that sort of goes to the fundamental dishonesty in the system.
Well, I guess then that leads me to another question that a lot of people are wondering about, which is, do you think that an MBA is useful for a career in business?
No, I think, look, I think I think that's too abstract a way to, this is way too abstract a way to frame it. So it's always a question, what is it that you're studying? What is it you actually want to do? I think I would encourage people to think, to have some default plan of what you're going to do. You know, I think the conventional thing you're always told is you should sort of just explore all these different things. The risk with exploring all these different things is that you end up defaulting after 2 years to what everyone else does, which is often, I think, one of the worst things you can do. And so have a default plan. This is what the default plan is. This is how the classes I'm taking fit into this default plan. You know, a bad plan is still, I think, always much better than no plan at all.
So when we connect this to your background, there are several questions about, you know, you did Stanford twice, but you also were a chess master, you studied philosophy. Which of these experiences were most formative in shaping the way that you look at the world today?
You know, it's again, I'm going to come back. You can't run this experiment twice, so it's hard to say exactly. I think that there was a way in which going to Stanford was good because of the links to Silicon Valley and the way in which a lot of my friends got involved in Silicon Valley, and that turned out to be a good place to be over the last few decades. I think that, but it's very hard to run the experiment twice.
Well, if we take this then back to the industry conversation, there are questions about what industry you think won't exist in 20 years.
There probably are industries that are going to change a fair bit. Certainly one that's I don't really like. I'm not sure any of them will really go away, but I do think the media industry remains under way more pressure than people realize, and so this is like not a very interesting answer because people sort of understand it, but that's one that I think we need to think that people still seem to not have really thought through how the business models there need to change. I think that I don't know. I think most industries will sort of still exist. They'll probably be in a somewhat different form. I think finance is going to get changed a lot in the next few decades. It probably is going to get regulated a lot more, but I think maybe there also will be some new opportunities. So I'd say finance is one where it may change more than people think, even though it's still going to be very important.
We have a number of questions also about who your role models are and who inspires you. Is there anything or anyone that stands out?
You know, I think the role model question is always a very tricky one for me to answer, given my focus on trying to do something new, different, that's not been done before. So there's certainly elements of things people have done that are very inspiring. So you know, some of the people who started all these great companies. But on some level, I actually really do think everything, you know, happens just once.
So that connects to one of the more interesting parts of the book, among many, where you think that Malcolm Gladwell is at least half wrong when he talks about luck and chance and its role in our success. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, there's always one of the most important questions in business or life is how much of it is a matter of luck or not. You can't run the experiment twice. It's very hard to know. I think we live in a society in which people tend to say that it's very dominated by luck, and I found that to be sort of a bad perspective to have when I've used it. So when I'm investing in different startups, and if I say to myself, I can't figure out what's going on here, I'm just buying a lottery ticket. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. That sort of way of thinking about it normally correlates with making really bad investments. So if you treat people or investments as lottery tickets, you've already psyched yourself into losing money. And so what I tend to think really goes on is that it's not a lottery ticket, or when you think it's a lottery ticket, or when you think it's random, you really are just being lazy. You're not thinking hard enough about what's going on. If you paid more attention, you could actually figure things out. So I think it's always a good frame for us to have that the future is something that we're going to try to control, we're going to try to master chance, and we're not going to be swept away by the winds of fortune.
Well, another question that's coming up a lot is to talk a little bit about your leadership style and when you are running the show or managing people, what you do differently from most others.
Well, I'm very, again, there's always the no competition ever. We want to sort of avoid competition in all forms on the business level as well as internally. And I think people always think that conflicts happen when people want different things. And I think conflicts normally happen when people want the same things. And so if you're sort of a sociopathic boss who wants to just mistreat your employees, the formula for doing it is to tell two people to do the exact same thing. And you will automatically generate a conflict out of nothing at all. And so I think there's always this incredible need to try to go the other way, to make sure that people's roles are not redundant, that they're well differentiated. And this is an extremely tricky challenge in a small company or a startup where there's a lot of fluidity. The roles tend to change a lot. But the conflicts at PayPal or any of the other businesses I've been involved with always centered on poorly differentiated roles where there was a lot of overlap. At PayPal, David Sachs was the head of the product team, had this line which was that the product was a single seamless whole, which was somewhat true, but was also this formula for never-ending conflict because it meant that the product team got to dictate things to everybody in the rest of the organization because everybody else somehow touched the product. And so there was overlap and conflict with product almost everywhere. And so when you said that the product was a single seamless whole, that was, in a way, on another level, was a formula whereby the product team was at war with everybody inside the company.
Do you have a formula or a process, at least, when you're coaching entrepreneurs or giving them advice for how they should think about which of their ideas to pursue?
There's a pattern recognition where if people have a number of different ideas, this again is another permutation on the anti-luck thing. If I see a presentation that says, we have this great idea and we're going to make money in one of these 5 ways, A or B or C or D or E, we're not really sure which is going to work. We're going to sort of experiment with them, try to figure it out. That's always sort of alarming and not very, very inspiring. It's always much better if people say, we're just going to make money doing A, because it suggests you've actually thought it through, you think it's going to actually work. Whereas when you list A through E, that sounds like it's a superset, you have more things going on, but the reality is that you often haven't really thought through them very carefully. And so I think whenever people come up with like lists of options, lists of choices like this, that's often, it's often again a version of being lazy, not thinking really hard about what actually might work.
One of the most entertaining parts of the book, I thought, was when you commented on what you discovered about tech CEOs who wear suits. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, this was again, I'll preface it by saying that there are no hard and fast sartorial rules that are timeless and eternal and always true in all places and so on. But I think in the clean tech bubble in Silicon Valley, there was this very striking contrast to the engineers running Web 2.0 companies generally wore T-shirts. The clean tech executives tended to wear suits, and it sort of made them look like they were bad at sales and worse at tech. And so I think and so there's nothing. I think there's nothing wrong with someone who's a salesperson running a company. Sometimes that's really critical, but sales is always disguised. It's always hidden, and so we never, investment bankers are people who sell companies, or politicians are people who sell themselves. But someone who's a transparent salesperson, where you can see that they're a salesperson, is just really bad. It's like, so the stereotypical salesperson is a used car dealer, and you never want to look like you're a salesperson.
Are there other mistakes that you see entrepreneurs making that you wish you could just say, sort of blanket rule, no more of this? And how much of that is due to Shark Tank?
I don't know. There are all sorts of different. I always am hesitant to give these absolute categorical kinds of rules. It's probably. Yeah, there are all sorts of things that you see over and over again. But I think it's often. I would say the single one I'll just come back to is the defining markets that are too big, being too comfortable with competition. I dislike, another term that I go after in my book is this idea of disruption, where you want to be a disruptor, you want to disrupt some industry. And I think it's another one of these sort of buzzwords that's really, really overrated. The disruptive kid in elementary school gets sent to the principal's office. Disruptive people look for trouble and they usually find it. Napster was a company that set out to disrupt the music industry. They were on the cover of Time magazine one year. The next year they got shut down by the government. And sort of the name of the company was problematic. You nap some music, you nap a kid, and so you don't want to define yourself as, yes, maybe there is a big sclerotic industry that is kind of screwed up, but you don't want to define yourself as a destructive force. You want to define yourself as doing something constructive.
So one interesting question here. This is definitely not an experiment you can repeat, but would Peter Thiel, the investor, invest in Peter Thiel, the founder, if we went back to pre-PayPal?
These are really unfair questions.
Welcome to Wharton.
I would. Obviously, I'd like to think that I would. I think that I think there's always a tendency to forget. And this is always like the history always gets so fictionalized. You forget how hard it was. We sort of started PayPal The first financing round was February of '99, where we raised $500,000 in sort of angel money in our seed round. And by March of 2000, 13 months later, we raised $100 million in a sort of Series C round. And getting the $100 million was probably about as hard, or maybe a little easier, than getting the first $500,000. And so, yeah, you had all sorts of really crazy encounters with people. You know, Chinese restaurant, it's all random. You're just a lottery ticket. I have no idea what I'm going to do. I'm just going to look at the fortune cookie and see whether they'll give you the money. The fortune cookie was good. The person still didn't give me the money. And so you had sort of all sorts of experiences like this. And so I think one of the things that always happens is that you tend to forget quite how tough it was to get started, how hard it was to have access in one way or another, and this is sort of and so I'd like to say the answer is yes. I would worry that I might not even get the email, might not even get through the filter or something like that.
So I guess one closing question then before we wrap things up for tonight. I think there are a lot of people in the room who are inspired by your vision for making technology useful to the world. And I'm just curious, as you think about people charting their careers and their paths, it's often hard to predict how the future is going to play out. Where would you recommend investing for people who really want to do work that not only makes them financially successful, but also improves the world in some way?
Well, I'm always a little bit skeptical of social entrepreneurship, although I'm very much in favor of mission-oriented companies. So let me distinguish the two. Social entrepreneurship is always ambiguous because it's unclear what the word social means. And social can mean, on the one hand, that it's good for society, or it can mean that it's good as seen by society. And in the second meaning, you often end up with something that many, many different people are doing. So a lot of education-related startups, we think education can be improved, and all these different ways to fix it, have this social entrepreneurship component where they're seen as good. You immediately get this feeling, oh, that's a good company, that's a good thing to do. But then it's something too many different people are doing. Whereas a mission-oriented company is one where if you didn't work on this problem, nobody would. And I think that's always a good test. When Elon started SpaceX, part of the pitch was, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to work on the rockets going to Mars. And this was very inspiring to a certain group of rocket scientists who got involved early on in the company. And the question, it wouldn't somehow SpaceX wouldn't quite fit into our standard definition of social entrepreneurship, even though Elon would say, well, it's really important for us to become an interplanetary species, and this is actually good for society, but it's probably not seen as good by society. And so we always want to do things where, if your company wasn't working on it, the problem wouldn't get solved. If you weren't working on it, it wouldn't get solved. And I think always go for that sort of counterfactual meaning. And you don't want to ever be in a place where you're just one of 100 cogs in the machine, and if it's not you, there are another 100 people to replace you the next day. You want to be in a place where you're doing something that can't easily be replicated, can't easily be replaced, either on individual level or the level of a company or any other project you're involved in.
So the last question that's rolling in is a question about what you would recommend people read if they want to enrich themselves. And I'm going to take that one and say, please read 0 to 1. I think in all seriousness, it's a totally brilliant book. I don't think anyone should be allowed to start a company or invest in a company without reading it first. Folks in the audience, I know you will probably disagree with some of the things that Peter writes, but you should be challenged to think about them. And I think it's a book that can fundamentally transform the way we think about entrepreneurship, as well as the way we organize our daily activities. And we are tremendously grateful for you writing it and also being here to share your insights with us. Thank you, Peter.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.